This is the really the keynote for the African American History Month, and we couldn't do better than having Dr. Emily Blanck come. But I want to introduce Dr. Henry, who will introduce Dr. Blanck. And I just want to mention, in case that our Holocaust Center has a number of programs planned. The next one coming up is going to be really interesting, Israel-Palestine discussion. So bring your boxing gloves. That's coming up towards the end of the month. Also, you may see back there, many of you may know that we've collected 1.5 million buttons, and there's going to be there's a little postcard there. Please grab one. In the gallery, we're going to have a program of the buttons, and eventually we're going to do them on campus. So anyway, a lot of stuff coming up.
Thank y'all so much for having us here. I'm going to have to get used to people mixing up my name. We have a new president coming in, Dr. Harris. He's used to calling me DT, so to say Dr. Henry, I can see the mix-up, but I'm not the president yet. We are so excited for today. For those of you that don't know, last year when we were here, Dr. Blanck's husband spoke to you all from this same room, and it was exciting, and I expect equal excitement today. Dr. Blanck teaches courses on intellectual history, historical methods, and U.S. legal history. She also teaches courses for American Studies. Dr. Blanck received her BA in history from the University of Texas at Austin, where she also majored in African American Studies. Dr. Blanck received her MA at the College of William & Mary and her PhD from Emory University. Dr. Blanck's first book, Tyrannicide, Forging an American Law of Slavery in Revolutionary South Carolina and Massachusetts, was published in 2014 with the University of Georgia Press. She is currently working on the project Juneteenth, Creating America's Emancipation Holiday. Thus far, this project has resulted in an article on Juneteenth in San Francisco and the Western Historical Quarterly in 2019, and an embodied entry into the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of American History entitled Juneteenth and the Emancipation Holidays 2020. I would like to present some and introduce to others, Dr. Blanck.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, Dr. Weisberger, Dr. Henry, and Melissa. I appreciate you coming. I'm from New Jersey, Eagles country, so we're very happy. It was an exciting weekend for us. So I'm going to be sharing history and research from my first book, Tyrannicide. And I want to just whiz through like 200 years of history in 45 minutes, so bear with me. But I want to also give you food for thought for why this history is relevant, why we need it today. I think that's really important to keep in mind. So I want to draw on the more extraordinary elements of the history of Massachusetts, and especially the history of slavery in Massachusetts. It's always been a place that's valued its history and uses its memory of the past to shape its present and its future. This connection to the past is important for you as citizens and how the state has developed both culturally and legally. I want to encourage you to keep that direct connection between the laudable past and the present today. And with that sense, and I'm hoping that students do here, I know there are not that many students, but I really want students to think a lot about who you want to be, right? You choose who you are, and you're going to choose the experiences of your ancestors, the cultural heritage, the significant events of your past that shape who you are. And that's why history can be really, really important. How we perceive ourselves and our place in society is shaping who we think we are and how we'll proceed in the world. And history is very important. And I think that the laudable past of Massachusetts, I'm going to talk a little bit about how complicated it is, and it's not perfect, but the laudable past gives us people who live in Massachusetts an opportunity to really do something better. And really, like the two things that we really, one of the main things we look at when we think about the history, oh my goodness, I can't get this slide to go. Think about the slide about the past in Massachusetts, is especially the history of abolitionism. It was the first state to end slavery immediately. And of course, the leading abolitionists came from Massachusetts in the 1830s. And at the same time that we have this laudable past that I really want you to draw from, it's also important to remember that there's an imperfect past, right? That Massachusetts had this constant clash between ideals and interests. And that conflict between ideals and interests has really led to slavery taking root permanently, very early in Massachusetts. And it has also led to, many other things that did not mean that this is a perfectly free place to be black in this state. For instance, we can think, in fact, I'm just going to bring this up because I didn't put it in my talk, but in my conversations this morning, Massachusetts has a very, very strong connection to the slave trade, right? That a lot of the mills that you see in this area were funded because slave trade in Massachusetts ended the same time that those mills came in. The money to build those mills came from slave trade, right? That this is part of the past of Massachusetts. Massachusetts is also gave black Americans, even though they freed black Americans, that founding generation in Massachusetts gave them second-class citizenship. We also, many of us probably remember the awful things that happened around busing in Massachusetts, right? This is not a perfect place. And it's important to have both of those, to remember and hold on to both of those things when we think about our past, because this makes us human, right? This is what makes our history approachable. But whenever we refuse to let those highest ideals drive how we make our decisions, that's when we go the wrong direction. And I just want to think about when we do go towards the ideals, the ideas that we want, we can slowly, imperfectly make a lasting impact. And so I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning. I'm going to go back to John Winthrop, right? In 1630, maybe he gave the model of Christian charity speech. Historians are in debate. But this speech really has become sort of the origin story of what Massachusetts is about. And you can see the idealism in this quote, right? Not only now, the only way to provide for our posterity is to follow the counsel of Micah, to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. For this end, we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection, for we must consider that we shall be a city upon the hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. This state was founded in this incredible, utopian ideal, right? That there's going to be this communal society. They're going to have more mercy. They're going to be judicial. But that history is also paired with the fact that if you did not agree with them, you could be exiled, banished, executed, right? And so this very idealistic past also has its roots in hierarchy, right? John Winthrop definitely believed in hierarchy. In the same speech, he talks about there being rich people and poor people, right? That some people would be in servitude and other people would be rulers, right? That both things exist at the same time. And as I said earlier, those who refuse to be strict Puritans, you're out, right? So this really venerable past gives us inspiration, but it also reminds us that we're all imperfect and products of what we are trying to accomplish. And perhaps nothing reminds us more of that than our relationship with Native Americans and the early Puritans, right? Slavery in Massachusetts did not begin with Africans. It began with Native Americans. As Massachusetts was warring with the Narragansetts and the Pequots, not only were they pushing them out, murdering them pretty ruthlessly. This is an ambush of people sleeping in this image of Pequot War. But they enslaved them, and they enslaved them not only to work here in Massachusetts, but more than that, they enslaved them so that they could trade them to Barbados and to Bermuda, to exile for good those people who they found threatening. And it's not an accident that this is how African slavery comes to Massachusetts. In 1638, Winthrop trades 35 Indian slaves for Africans on the ship Desire in 1638. And that wasn't the end of it. In King Philip's War, in the end of the 17th century, they tried, when war was not going well and they were trying to bring peace, they thought that if they enslaved them, they could use that as a way to sort of bring peace. And so they sent Quite to be a spy in the Wampanoag and asked to find out if he could sort of broker peace with the Wampanoag. And what he found is that when he went there, he found that they knew what enslavement was, and it was not what they wanted. They were not willing to trade peace for enslavement. They made clear that that enslavement was so dangerous that they would align with other native groups that were not always their allies in the past in order to fight against becoming slaves to the British. And so I'm going to now shift to African slavery. Only 3 years after Desire landed in Boston, the Massachusetts Bay Colony created the first law in the colonies, the absolute first law in the colonies that dictated what slavery was. And this law was important because it's a very complicated law in many ways. It's different than any other law that comes in any other state. And again, this adds to this sort of complex relationship between ideals and reality. The law appeared in this first legal code, the 1641 Body of Liberties, and it was unique. Rather than legalizing slavery, it actually says there shall never be any bond, slavery, villanage, or captivity. So it starts saying there shall be no slavery. So this sounds great. However, then it says, except when they're lawful captives, like the Pequots, or they're strangers that willingly sell themselves, like the slave trade that is beginning to teem all over the Atlantic Ocean, right? And so or are sold to us, right? So this is they're not going to, but basically what they say is that we're not going to enslave each other. And they're drawing from the Bible when they're doing this. In stating that they're going to use the law of God that was established in Israel, they're using something called Mosaic, what we call Mosaic slavery, the slavery that Moses lived under. Moses was told by God that he could not enslave others of his tribe, but he could enslave his neighbors, right? And that's basically what they see themselves being offered. And this is going to, but at the same time, there's language in here that's going to become the root of why enslaved people in Massachusetts are able to fight for their own freedom. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Actually, I'm going to go back and I just want to highlight one thing. So in a minute, we're going to talk about this next line, which says, established, and that they should have liberties and Christian usages. I want to focus on that phrase next. In looking at the rest of the law, and we look at this idea of liberties and Christian usages, we see more of that unique idealism of Massachusetts. The law is solidly in their religious mission, and they also set up a precedent by using the word liberties to create a new relationship with enslaved people. And so we'll see Cotton Mather, when he writes in the Negro Christianized that enslaved people can be baptized and still remain slaves. But he also tells masters that if they mistreat their slaves, they will be swiftly harmed by God, right? That God will swiftly bring their justice. But What will also happen is as the 18th century moves along, this law will recognize the rights of black folks and enslaved people as civil beings. In 1670, they took out the strangers provision, and which created slaves as a new status as subjects of the king. And their rank as subject was not equal to those of whites, especially white male property holders, but they deserved protection from the king. And as white male subjects were expanding rights as legal persons, slaves possessed more rights as second-class citizens. So that by the American Revolution, we'll find that uniquely in Massachusetts, we find that slaves have the right to own property, they have the right to marry, they have the right to sue, they have the right to petition, right? And that's completely unique in New World slavery. And it comes from this idea that there's supposed to be liberties granted to those people who are enslaved. And this is going to become the tools that are going to be used by enslaved people to get their own freedom. However, let's not be too idealistic about this. They're still property. They still can be bought and sold, even though they're property that can own property, right? They're still not paid. They might gain, there might be ways that slave owners might allow them to hire themselves out and they will get money, but there's no legal requirement. They're subject to the will of the owner, which is really especially the experience of women, enslaved women in Massachusetts, because they are almost all domestic servants who worked 24/7 for their owners. And their ownership was lifetime, and their offspring were also owned by their slave owners, right? In many other slave societies outside the New World, when your children did not necessarily follow in being property, but in the New World, you were. Let me just briefly go over a little bit about enslaved life. Historian William Pearson described slave life in Massachusetts as family slavery, not because they were treated particularly well. In fact, Puritans were well known for beating and forcing their children to work. So even if you're a child, this doesn't mean that your life is going to be good. But because the slavery was only for the most part, there's a few exceptions, which I talked about. If you want to know more about it, I can tell you more about it. But for the most part, if you were an enslaved person, you lived in a household with one or two other enslaved people. And what this meant was that it was very, very difficult to get married and have children. If you were married, you often married somebody who lived in another household, maybe somebody who lived in another town. My research found, looking at the vital statistics, the vital records of Massachusetts, that 1/4 of married enslaved couples lived in 2 different towns from each other. So this is not like you're going to go and live and have a real relationship with that person. Moreover, most owners did not want, unlike the South, where breeding was an advantage, having children was seen as a disadvantage. It took the labor of one or two people that you had in your household out of commission, and then you had to raise and care for a child. And so children were seen as a burden, not as an advantage. So it was, even though the slavery could be described as family slavery, it did not allow enslaved people to have their own families. And the division of labor was very divided by sex. Men actually had a wide range of things they did. They worked on ships, in turpentine factories, shops, distilleries. They even had skilled jobs as blacksmiths, coopers, carpenters. And even if they were domestic servants, they probably did not live with their wife. Female slaves almost exclusively worked as household servants. And as such, they were always subject to the will of their slave owners and rarely got time to themselves. Amidst that experience, despite how oppressive it was, the law offered an opportunity for freedom. And that was through freedom suits. Freedom suits are cases where an enslaved person sues their owner to become free, right? And the first freedom suit happens in 1701, so very, very early. This is Adam. His case actually was very celebrated. There's actually a flurry of pamphlet material that comes out of it. One of the very first published anti-slavery documents in the entire history of the world is out of this Adam case. However, Adam was an anomaly. He's a freedom suit in 1701. There's only one other case until 1760. So this is not something that is happening very often. But between 1763 and 1783, there's an explosion of freedom suits. 24 cases come before the courts. And they're very interesting because they tell us a lot about this complex history. The white judges, plaintiffs, and lawyers and judges reflect the sense that slavery is something that is tied to natural freedom, that the idea of natural rights are tied to slavery. And that is that if you are a free person, you shouldn't be enslaved, that your natural state is not to be enslaved. But for the most part, what these cases do is they affirm slavery as being legal. They rarely say that slavery is not legal. Almost all of these enslaved people are actually suing because they're illegally enslaved. Perhaps they paid their owner for freedom. Perhaps there was a will that said that they were going to be free, right? And they're saying, I'm illegally enslaved. Well, the implication when a lawyer or an enslaved person says that is that there is legal slavery, right? So it's kind of a double-edged sword, two sides of the same coin. If I'm illegally enslaved, there are people who are legally enslaved, and that's part of the status. However, despite the fact that most of these cases, all but four of those cases, are pretty much establishing the legality of slavery, they start to unravel and provide an important avenue that other people are going to be using to challenge the legality of slavery. I also want to make a side note to note that, I hope you guys understand that 1763, this is the beginning of the Revolutionary Era. So this is all tied into the revolutionary rhetoric. However, these cases, almost entirely, the people who are taking these cases for the benefit of African Americans, the people who are making connections between slavery and natural rights, are almost all loyalists. So Peter Oliver, who was a justice in 1764's Jenny Slew case, basically says there's a contest here between property and liberty. And he says liberty is more important, which is shocking because most of these people lived under John Locke's world where, the core ideas are life, liberty, and property, right? And property is a core value, and he is saying, no, liberty is more important than property. And so he finds for Jenny Slew, although it was one of these cases that establishes the legality of slavery. And then one of the most important lawyers in all these cases is a man named Jonathan Sewell. His great-grandfather published one of those documents, one of those pamphlets in 1701 in that freedom suit. And he is also a loyalist, and he's actually going to make the case for one of the, he actually represents a lot of the cases, and he represents one of the two cases, early cases, where they were fighting to say slavery was unconstitutional, was against the Charter of Massachusetts. And so, this is not really a patriot cause, which is also something to sort of upend our expectations of what we see. And so what we see in the American Revolution is a change, right? Slaves and other people in Massachusetts are moving out of their subjects as citizens of the king. They're becoming citizens of their own right. And slavery is metaphorically and physically a challenge to and part of that revolutionary cause. Samuel Adams is going to talk about being enslaved, right, for a reason, and as a white person to Britain. And so slaves are going to utilize these rights during the revolution and increasingly push them to actually end slavery, not just challenge an individual slavery. So in addition to the freedom suits, there's lots of black writing during this period coming out of Massachusetts. Lemuel Haynes was a minister, and he wrote a couple of really important pieces opposing slavery. And then we have somebody like Phyllis Wheatley, who is challenging the idea that somebody was challenging expecting to be recognized as an equal, as a poetess, a talented poetess in her own right, and writing to George Washington. She felt like she had needed that recognition. But no set of documents shows this more than the Revolutionary Era petitions. There were 5 petitions that, all of them came out of Boston, that went to the General Court, which was basically the state legislature, calling for slavery to end. They all used the same kind of language that we've seen the entire history of Massachusetts. They talk about being Christian. They talk about rights. They talk about family, right? These are the things that they think that they deserve because they are in the state of Massachusetts. And they are actually pretty close to being successful. These petitions, one of the petitions actually leads to legislation being filed, but John Adams, who is down in Philadelphia, hears about this and he puts a kibosh on it. John Adams, like, you cannot pass legislation ending slavery. If you do that, you're going to challenge the fragility of this union that we're trying to create. And so basically, it's John Adams who gets slave legislation to stop in Massachusetts because he doesn't want to get people in the South angry for them to do that. Massachusetts is already getting this reputation of being a place that's more free. But John Adams is also involved in another really important chapter of the writing, of sort of thinking about the continuity of the history of the Puritans to the present, and that is his role in writing the state constitution. The state constitution that was passed in 1780 had become, it's the longest standing state constitution in the world. Did you know that? Our state constitution, your state constitution, is the only one that still exists for this long, and it becomes one of the models of the United States Constitution. So we're still living in that past in many ways here in Massachusetts. But I also want to highlight is that it says in its preamble that all men are born free and equal, and this becomes the ground that the enslaved people need to push to end slavery through legal action. The other thing that I think is really important, since we're sitting here at Bristol Community College, it also states that education is a natural right. The only state constitution that does that too, which I think is a laudable thing, right? We want to remember those things. And so slavery ends because these two people sued for freedom. Elizabeth Freeman is actually suing specifically to end slavery in Massachusetts. She is abused and sees her sister be abused, and she sues because she heard and John Ashley is her owner, he had a reading of the Declaration of Independence. She heard that and she was like, why am I not included in that? And so she goes to see a lawyer, Theodore Frederick, who takes her case. While her case is going through the courts, there's another case that's already been going on, Quock Walker's case in 1781. Now, Quock Walker is actually suing on being enslaved illegally. He was promised freedom in a will, and he's been entrapped. And however, it's Quock Walker's case that gets to the Superior Court first. And when it gets to the Superior Court, the Chief Justice of the case, Chief Justice William Cushing, instructs the jury to recognize that the state constitution of Massachusetts deems all people born free and equal, and therefore slavery shouldn't exist in the state. And so by the Chief Justice making this instruction to the jury, he's all but said that the courts will no longer support slavery. And this essentially ends slavery in Massachusetts. It's a quiet court case. There's no cheering in the streets, right? There's no parades, because it's something that just happens quietly. And in many ways, many people in Massachusetts had already assumed that slavery had ended. And we know this because of a story I'm going to share in a second. But this is really the point at which slavery ends. And it's because black folks use those ideals that Massachusetts had established from its beginning and uses it towards their own benefit. Now I want to talk about the tyrannicide affair. This is why my book is called Tyrannicide. It is because of this case. So in 1779, there's 2 Massachusetts privateers that captured a Spanish vessel with 34 enslaved South Carolinians. They had run away to the British down in Waccamaw Peninsula in South Carolina and had suffered through 2 naval battles before, one of which was against the Hazard and the Tyrannicide, which were 2 brigs from Massachusetts. They accompanied this Spanish vessel back to Castle Island in Boston, and the 34 people were basically put on that island. Actually, they were hired out to people in Boston. But pretty soon the state contacted the owners, and all but 14 of those enslaved people were taken back to South Carolina. They paid for a merchant to ship them back down, and they all went back. But there were brothers, Anthony and Percival Pauley. If you go down to South Carolina, there's a place called Pawleys Island. That's their land. The Pawleys had 14 of these enslaved people, and rather than ship them back, they put them under a lawyer named John Winthrop, so a little full circle here. And John Winthrop was supposed to watch over these enslaved people in Boston. And frankly, he didn't. It takes 4 years for the Pawleys to send their son-in-law, who's a lawyer, up here with the ship. So his name is Hasford. Hasford comes up with a ship ready to take these 14 people back down to South Carolina. And Winthrop has not really kept track of them. He's able to recover 8 of them. And Hasford demands to the local magistrate to put them in prison, or in the jail, right? And the jailer's like, they haven't done anything wrong. Why would we put them in jail? And so Hasford then appeals it, and it goes to the Superior Court. And so let me get to the next one. And so what happens is the Superior Court looks at the case. They have a full hearing, and only it's like 4 days later. So this happens very, very fast. And the court decided that they could not hold these 14 people, or these 8 people, and released all of them from the jail. However, and this decision infuriated Hasford. He basically flies back down to, South Carolina, goes to the governor, tattles on him, and says, "Look what they're doing in Massachusetts." The governor of Massachusetts, or the governor of South Carolina, Ben Gerard, writes to John Hancock, who is the governor of Massachusetts, very, very angry. John Hancock hands it over to William Cushing, our Chief Justice. This is all happening in the same year that slavery ends in Massachusetts, 1783. And Cushing writes an explanation of the case. And in the explanation, again, we're getting back to this complex past. Cushing does not challenge the right of the South Carolinians to own those enslaved people. He says, you have a right to come and pick them up. If a man has a right to the service of another who deserts his service, undoubtedly he has a right to take him and carry him home to his service again, which has always been the case of here without any action from the magistrate. Basically, come get your slaves, we're not going to put them in our jails. That's basically what so he is not challenging slavery anywhere but in the state of Massachusetts. And he's not even challenging in many ways for somebody to bring enslaved people to Massachusetts, which is what Pennsylvania will do in their Emancipation Act. And so in many ways, this could end in a bad way, right? These enslaved people could go back to Massachusetts, go back to South Carolina, but they don't. Hasford assumes that it still means that they've become freed, and we know for a fact that they did become free because and this is actually remarkable. I found 3 of them in the census in 1790, which it doesn't sound like that should be remarkable, but 3 heads of households were named over of this poly group. And it's remarkable because almost all of the people in the 761 Bostonian blacks are basically labeled as servants or labeled as Negro or mulatto. Their names are rarely put in there, but 3 of them actually have their name in there. So we know that they still ended up becoming free, practically, even if legally the polys could have come and returned them. And the reason I'm bringing this case up is not only because it shows sort of how fluid the law is, but it also becomes this big point of intrigue between the states, right? We know that South Carolina and Massachusetts are going to become primary combatants in the Civil War. And here, this tension is already existing. And I have a chapter in my book where I talk about how this probably is the foundation for the fugitive slave clause of the Constitution. Because here we have enslaved people getting to a free state, and what happens? South Carolina gets shafted, right? And so they want to make sure that this is in the Constitution. And I argue that this case had a big impact on that. So now if we look at post-war life for blacks in Massachusetts, it's not great, right? Even though they've now been freed, they're still treated as second-class citizens. Suffrage is not offered. Paul Cuff, whose portrait is here, his silhouette is portrayed here, petitioned twice for the state to recognize suffrage for blacks. And it's possible, it's likely, if not possible, if not likely, that a few towns actually did let individual black people vote, but it was not legally stated that they could vote. In fact, Paul Cuffey becomes so frustrated being in Massachusetts that he goes and founds Liberia. So he's an important figure in other ways. If you were an out-of-state in the 1780s, if you were found in the city from out of state, you were expelled from the state. They made these rosters, the newspapers full of rosters of names of people who don't belong in the state legally. So they did not want black folks coming and becoming refugees in Massachusetts. And then, of course, the poor laws are very strong in Massachusetts, and they are constantly expelling blacks. And the poor laws become really important because when slavery ends in Massachusetts, it really undermines the employment potential for blacks in the state, because Massachusetts citizens are racist, right? And they're going to hire poor whites over poor blacks. And they become, their economic status becomes very, very precarious, and the poor laws really, really put them in a really, really bad place. And sometimes they might even be sent to be indentures to the old people who enslaved them in the past. So this is just to say that we become free, but it's still not perfect in Boston or in Massachusetts. But we do still see the foundations of abolitionism being created here in the state of Massachusetts. And I want to focus on Garrison and Douglas, because the ideals of Massachusetts, the cultural and legal DNA that was created back in creating the liberties that the first law offered, provided a friendly place for abolitionism to grow. That this became a state where in a lot of different cities where abolitionism is going to grow, especially in this area, Garrisonianism grows. And Garrisonianism the Garrisonian abolitionist movement is interesting because it's the most idealistic of them all. It's the least practical too. Basically, they use this thing called moral suasion. We just need to convince the Southerners to free their slaves, and that's because he wants to be nonviolent. He doesn't want to use politics. He sees the Constitution, which is covered in slavery, as a corrupt document, right? So he doesn't want to be corrupted, and so he thinks that if he just shows and his followers think if they just show how immoral slavery is, that slavery, they'll be convinced. So there's this real idealism in the Garrisonian effort. But Frederick Douglass, who lives not very far, who lived very, very close to here in New Bedford, is much more practical. He even talks to John Brown, even though he thinks John Brown's a little wacky. He's not opposed to the idea of violence being used to end slavery because he knows how awful slavery is. Even though Douglass was not born in Massachusetts, this became the state of his refuge, right? And and I want to just highlight him because he really offers us a sort of a parting message, right? He was not afraid to be a patriot who recognized the hypocrisy of the United States, right? He loved the ideals of the United States. He thought the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution even, offered opportunities for freedom and offered an ideal place for, he could have easily moved to England. People in England were happy to have him. He chose to stay here because he felt like the United States had the potential to be a great place. However, it had a mortal sin and a deeply hypocritical stance in owning slaves. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with What's the Slave is the 4th of July, and there you can see the really, really harsh criticism that he gives to the United States. But what he wants us to recognize is that the United States is not just that ideal place, but it's this place of hypocrisy, and we need to stay here in dissent and push for the ideals of what America is about, not fall for the material interests that we have. Thank you. And that's it. Do you guys have any questions? Yeah.
As you were speaking, this was very interesting. I learned a lot. Thank you. I was wondering how Black literacy plays into all of this. Were Black people even educated? If they weren't earning any income, how could they afford to hire a lawyer? How did the process work for all these people?
Yeah, so first of all, the enslaved population in Massachusetts was more literate than most other places. And generally in urban communities, urban slavery usually comes with literacy because it was much more convenient for the slave owner to have a literate slave than an illiterate slave because they could do more things for you, right? They could go to the shop and buy things. They could do paperwork. There was just more opportunity. And also because some of these sort of familial ideals, there's a woman that, one of my favorite other figures that I don't talk about here, Lucy Terry Prince, who's from out west. Her slave owner teaches her how to write, the female slave owner and mistress. And she becomes the first Black poetess in Massachusetts. She writes, in Deerfield, Massachusetts, she writes a depiction of an Indian attack there. So there is a sort of sense that they're going to teach them how to write. So there is a strong basis of literacy. And also, when you don't have work for people to do, you sometimes hire them out. And this happens in the South too. You'll hire an enslaved person out, and usually you'll give a cut of the proceeds to the enslaved person themselves. And this offers them an opportunity to buy their freedom in a lot of cases. And again, this happens all throughout the American slave system. But in Massachusetts, if you're given money and you buy yourself out of freedom, the courts are going to support your freedom. In South Carolina, if you earn money and you buy yourself out of freedom, it's up to the owner whether they follow through on that deal. The courts will not support the enslaved person in that case. So that's generally, so it's still kind of an elite group that gets that opportunity. And as far as the lawyers, most of these lawyers are not doing this for the money. They're doing it as like a pro bono kind of situation. But there is opportunities for them to, especially male slaves, to earn money in order to become free, especially if they have those high level skills and things like that. It's a good question, Nate. Yes?
Yeah, first of all, I feel embarrassed, and I want to apologize for the fact there should be a lot more people here listening to this because it's very informative and interesting. I was particularly taken when you were talking about the idea that those in Massachusetts thought they could just tell the people in the South of South Carolina that this isn't a nice thing to do, and therefore it would change, and I can't help but think of how history repeats itself.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for the information, and I've learned a lot.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I know that chattel slavery, using like slavery being movable property, originated in the U.S.
Mhm.
Did it originate in Massachusetts? Did Massachusetts
So,
have chattel slavery?
Actually, chattel slavery is probably more originating in Latin America.
Okay, that
But
makes sense.
the whole New World had sort of this chattel form of slavery. And I mean, it was going to be defined slightly differently because of English law is different than Spanish and Portuguese law. But pretty much New World slavery is already, they're drawing off of an experience that they're already seeing in other parts of the world. So Barbados and Bermuda already have slavery, and they're totally aware of this. And in fact, Puritans might even have, I'm pretty sure Puritans have a settlement in Bermuda. Does that sound familiar to people? I can't remember. It's been a long time since I looked at that history. But so they're drawing off a tradition that's already going on. But it's the first place of the colonies to actually write a law instituting it as being legal in the country. So even though there's enslaved people in Virginia since 1619, they don't actually write a law saying that they're enslaved until 1660s, until they have to, until there's like some legal reasons that they have to. Massachusetts, because they're such rule followers, plus it comes pretty conveniently on the heels of the Body of Liberties being written, they want to have this in writing immediately, very, very quickly. So 2 years later, after they have black people enslaved in their area, they write laws trying to explain what slavery is and what slavery isn't, so that they can't enslave each other, I think. Any other questions? Yeah, Ron.
Can you talk more about Douglas, how he ended up in New Bedford, and then what role he played in the abolition movement? 'Cause, of course,
Yeah, I didn't, I'm trying to remember exactly how he ends up in New Bedford. It's been a couple years since I've read his narrative. You know, he gets freed with help from his wife, and I think I'm not going to remember. I'm going to make things up, I think, if I say something.
In any case, what role does with that as a base?
Yeah.
What role does he play in getting the abolitionist movement?
Yeah, in the abolition movement generally. Yeah, I mean, so like he does come up to Massachusetts, and I can't remember if it's New Bedford that he lands in originally. I'm blanking right now, but he comes here because it's a safe place to be, first of all, not because he wants to end slavery, but he's a very smart. I mean, I just imagine like Douglas being one of these incredibly, not only intelligent but also incredibly charismatic human beings, one of those superhumans. Have you ever met Cory Booker? He kind of glows, and that's the first time I saw charisma. I was like, oh my God, he's like glowing. I don't understand. Anyway, so I kind of imagine him glowing. Anyway, so Douglas is just working. He's just kind of making his way through, and some people notice that he is really smart and really eloquent, and they encourage him to go to a anti-slavery event in Nantucket. And they ask him to tell his story there. And so that's sort of where he gets started. And because he's so good at telling his story, Garrison basically brings him under his wing and makes him, you know, essentially like a little doll that goes around telling his story, how he was enslaved, eventually writes the first narrative, right? And so he becomes a really good example of what slavery was about. However, Douglas is going to break beyond what Garrison wants him to be. And there's a lot of tension between Garrison and Douglas, because Douglas wants to do more. Once he gets a taste of what it means and understands what it all means and is able to eloquently talk about it, he pushes for more. First of all, he wants his actual freedom. He does not, he's going around the country telling his story. Well, he's going around the North telling his story, and he's an enslaved person that could be captured and taken back to Maryland any moment. So he finds some friends in England who buy his freedom. And Garrison finds this reprehensible. Garrison is really upset at him for doing this because he sees him as buying into the whole system of slavery. Again, Garrison's living in this very idealized world, and Douglas is like, no, I just want to be free. And so Douglas actually goes to England and spends some time in England before coming back as a free person. And when he comes back, he's his own man. He writes his narrative, My Bondage, My Freedom. So if you're going to ever read a Douglas narrative, always read My Bondage, My Freedom. It is it's a masterpiece. The way that he is able to describe slavery, he's like a natural sociologist. He can understand that slavery is a system and not an action of individuals. And he sees that individuals, white and black, are trapped in the system, and is able to talk about it in really, really sophisticated ways through his story. And then he finds the North Star, his own newspaper, and sort of becomes his own abolitionist in his own right. And of course, he'll be a compatriot of Lincoln. Lincoln will seek advice from him. So he becomes, much bigger than what Garrison wanted him to be. But, yeah.
I thought it was really interesting with the Body of Liberties, how you mentioned that, even in that original document, they said there shall be no slavery except, and obviously like that language is still something that exists today in the 13th Amendment. And I was wondering if, in any of the northern states or like at any point if there was like legal documentation that didn't have it phrased in that except way, because it seems like we started with it, we still have it today. There's ever been a point without it.
It's very smart. I can't think of any specific place where they don't put these exceptions. But I think, that the Emancipation Proclamation, is an accept document. I mean, I think almost all of our documents that sort of end slavery have an exception to them, in part because we want to be able to compel other human beings in some format at some point, and because of our material interests, right? But I think I really appreciate you kind of bringing that, because I don't think I'd ever thought about the 13th Amendment. There's just like this really strong trail between the two. Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm sorry, I've been, another.
No, it's okay.
In listening to this as a lifelong Massachusetts resident, it's somewhat distressing to see that over a period of 200 years, we don't seem to have learned our lessons very well. And, which is bothersome. And I think that hearing this kind of information, I think more people should, and perhaps in my idealistic mind, we could somehow get beyond where we are.
Yeah, and that's why Douglas is one of my favorite people, because he's somebody who can bring ideals and reality together. You can't be Garrison and just say great things, just hope that some kind of magic is going to happen. You have to do both of those things. You have to be able, because we're materially oriented people, right? We have elections, and we always talk about it's the economy, stupid, right? That's how we make our decisions, is often based on what is going to be most comfortable and make us feel safest. And living on our ideals doesn't always make us safe, and doesn't always means that we might have to make sacrifices, or see the world in a different way, or see our status in a different way. And clearly we're in a moment that's where we're living, right? That a lot of people are feeling uncomfortable with strides that have been made among minoritized people, and they want to pull back. That this DEI thing seems really, really threatening, which is hard for me to understand, but it's definitely a reality. We've definitely heard and seen that this feels threatening, to let other people to sort of prioritize other people beyond yourself. Yeah, Ron.
This is probably a long lecture on your left on Juneteenth.
Yeah.
Could you maybe mention how that may have affected what was going on in Massachusetts once that?
The Juneteenth?
Yeah.
Juneteenth is pretty far away from Massachusetts as far as my research goes. I mean, Juneteenth really it commemorates the end of slavery in Texas. And what my research is trying to do is like look at why, but it might address a little bit your question in a sense. Why did we choose to have an Emancipation Day that is Texas's Emancipation Day? And you know, the one big thing that Massachusetts has in the history of Juneteenth is that the flag. So if you've seen the Juneteenth flag, the red and blue with the arc on it, that was designed by Ben Haith, who lived in Boston, and he was a Juneteenth activist here in Boston. But Juneteenth at first was just like an emancipation holiday, and that was a very common thing throughout the United States. In fact, there were emancipation days in Boston beginning in 1834. They celebrated the emancipation of the British slaves because they were so excited some slaves got emancipated. So there's always been this holiday of emancipation. And in the South, they really, after the Civil War, they exploded, including in Texas. Texas's became called Juneteenth. But it also became tied into Texas identity. And because it became tied into Texas identity, when Jim Crow came and folks were celebrating emancipation and looking back and noticing that their lives still were really, really dire, with lynchings and dire poverty and second-class citizenship, that in most places in the United States, after World War I, the United States becomes more nationalized instead of being local, and basically emancipation days disappear everywhere except Texas. And in Texas, they survive. And it's partially because it becomes a part of being a Texan, a black Texan, instead of becoming just an emancipation holiday. And that allows it to kind of last a little bit longer, and people notice it and start celebrating in other parts of the country, including in Boston by the 1970s. That's my connection between Juneteenth and Boston. And yeah, I can come back and talk about Juneteenth for a really long time. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much, guys.
As you mentioned, we need this history, and